Hello, Model Railroad fans. My name is Freddie, and this is my garage layout. I call it my 4x8x2 layout because I originally started with just a 4x8 sheet in DC, and then over time I've gradually moved to two 4x8s running DCC. I started in April of 2017, so I've been at this almost 5 years, and I had a lot of frustration, some fun, and anyway, I just keep plugging along. I want to talk about the age. I've decided to run the era of my layout and also the road. So I've decided to run Southern Pacific, maybe a little Western Pacific. In the past, I bought just about any locomotive on eBay I could get for a deal. I'm a sucker for a deal. And I'm going to run in an era of maybe 1955 to 1975. And I'm going to focus on EMD GP series locomotives. The six-wheel truck locomotives don't do well on my narrow curves. So I'm picking that era because a lot of my Walters models have brick. They look older. I mean, they look even older than that, but that's kind of what I decided to do because I like the GP. And I did a lot of research here in the last week on Southern Pacific. I bought 2 different books and I scoured the internet for information. And I put together a rather lengthy history of the Southern Pacific going back to early days in 1885 up through when they got taken over by Union Pacific. I don't deal a lot with the recent days. I haven't studied that very much, but anyway, this video is about Southern Pacific, and I'm going to talk about EMD locomotives and show you some pictures of the ones I have and the ones I hope to buy. So thank you, subscribers, and especially you guys that do comments. I appreciate the feedback, and I have some fun doing this, although as you can tell by my little unhappy face emojis and cussing, it's challenging. And I got a little story that happened to me the last couple days that I'll repeat at the end of the video. I don't want to waste time here doing it, but you know, it's always something for me. Thanks for watching. This part of the video, I'm going to give a brief summary of the GP models that EMD built up through the time frame that I'm interested in modeling. So they started in 1947 with the GP7. They had built, EMD had built F models, but I'm just focused on the GP models. Sold 2,700 of those, moved to the GP9, sold a lot of those, 4,000, over 4,000. Southern Pacific had 328 of those, I have 2. There's 18, the 7, 9, and 18 look very similar. 20 had a different body style with a low nose. 260 SP54, I have 1. Then they went to the 38, 30, I'm sorry, 28, 30, 32. SP had 160 of those. I'd like to buy one of those, I don't have one. And they had the 38, made 900 of those. Then they upgraded that to the 38-2. SP had 45, I'd like to get one of those. They had the 39, the 39-2, those weren't too popular. 40s were better, and then they upgraded the 40 to the 40-2, sold quite a few of those. SP has 68, had 68, I have 2. This one was originally a Denver and Rio Grande, not original SP, and I have 1 switcher. It's actually a GP15AC. So that's a summary of the EMD models. As part of the video, I'm going to talk about Southern Pacific's history. In 1860, Theodore Jewett, a civil engineer, came to California to work on the Sacramento Valley Railroad. And after he finished that, he had a vision of connecting the eastern part of the country to California. He couldn't find anybody in San Francisco to finance him, and he went to the federal government, and they wouldn't finance him, but he finally found 4 guys in Sacramento that would fund him. These were merchants that made a lot of money during the gold rush. So in 1861, the Central Pacific Railroad was founded by himself and these 4 guys they called the Big Four: Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker. In 1862, President Lincoln signs the Pacific Railroad Act authorizing Central Pacific to build the western section of the Transcontinental Railroad, while the Union Pacific built toward California. In 1865, Southern Pacific Railroad was founded by a guy named Phillips and other San Francisco businessmen to build a route from San Francisco to San Diego. 1866, Southern Pacific was designated to build the western section of the Second Continental Railroad. 1869, Central Pacific and Union Pacific meet in Promontory, Utah to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1869, Southern Pacific was bought by Central Pacific. The Big Four wanted to be a monopoly in railroading in California. 1871, the Texas and Pacific Act authorizes Texas and Pacific Railroad to build west to Yuma and the Southern Pacific to build east to Yuma. 1873, Southern Pacific started building its own locomotives in Sacramento to add to other models. 1874, Southern Pacific reaches Bakersfield and work begins on the Tehachapi Loop. 1876, the Tehachapi Loop is completed for trains from San Francisco to LA. 1878, the Texas and Pacific fails to get to Yuma. In 1881, Southern Pacific connects to Atchison, Pico, Santa Fe, and Deming, New Mexico. And they finally connect with the Texas and Pacific on the very western edge of Texas in Sierra Blanca. The same year, Southern Pacific purchased control of Texas and New Orleans Railroad, trying to gain control over Texas. 1883, trains meet in San Antonio as the second transcontinental railroad is completed. In 1885, Southern Pacific buys some Morgan steamships to connect New Orleans to New York. 1883, the first refrigerator cars loaded with oranges in LA headed to the East Coast. 1885, oil is starting to be used instead of wood or coal in Southern Pacific locomotives. In 1900, the driving force, Huntington, dies. 1901, Union Pacific under Harriman acquires control of Southern Pacific. 1906, the Great San Francisco earthquake destroys the Southern Pacific offices. The same year, the Pacific Fruit Express is formed. 1909, Southern Pacific of Mexico is founded. 1913, the Supreme Court orders Union Pacific to divest its control of Southern Pacific. 1917, the federal government takes control of the American railroads during the World War I. 1923, Western Pacific joins the Pacific Fruit Express with Southern Pacific and Union Pacific. 1928, Southern Pacific purchases several small Texas railroads. 1929, the Pacific Motor Trucking Company begins service. Southern Pacific buys control of Northwest Pacific from Santa Fe, reaches up into the northwest part of the country. 1932, Southern Pacific buys control of Corn Belt, officially the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad. SP loses money for the first time, but it's the only railroad not to go into receivership or bankruptcy during the Depression. 1934, Southern Pacific organizes all the small Texas railroads under the Texas and New Orleans name. In Texas at that time, the home office had to be in Texas to run a railroad. 1935, the overnight fast merchandise freights were introduced from San Francisco to LA. 1937, Southern Pacific is the third largest industrial corporation in the U.S. The Sacramento shops build their last steam engine. Southern Pacific is the only coast-to-coast system due to its steamships from the southeast ports to the northeast ports. 1939, the first diesel switcher enters operations. 1942, Southern Pacific gears up to support World War II. By the end of World War II, Southern Pacific served more military installations than any other railroad. 1946, after the war, Southern Pacific begins a $2 million expansion and rebuilding program. In 1947, the first road diesel freight locomotives enters operations. 1948, new Streamliner diesel passenger trains were introduced. By 1950, the Pacific Fruit Express has 38,000 refrigerated cars. 1951, Southern Pacific sells the Mexican track to the Mexican government. 1953, the first trailer on flat car piggyback service starts. 1954, Southern Pacific loses $58 million on passenger services as people use their cars more and airlines become a larger carrier of people. 1955, the hydro-cushion freight car is introduced. 1956, Southern Pacific opens a pipeline from Texas to California. 1957, the last steam locomotive was retired from main service. 1958, Southern Pacific discontinues freight service in the San Francisco Bay. 1959, Southern Pacific moves more tonnage of freight than any other U.S. railroad, replacing the Pennsylvania system. 1961, Texas and New Orleans formally merges with Southern Pacific after the Texas law is changed. 1962, container services are introduced. 1965, the ICC rejects Southern Pacific bid to buy the Western Pacific.